He sat alone for 40 minutes in one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, a tired single father in a suit that didn't quite fit, watching the door, checking his phone, pretending not to notice the pity in the waiter's eyes. His date was never coming. But then the empty chair moved, and the woman who sat down across from him was worth more than most small countries. She was 50. She was a billionaire, and she had just decided that the most interesting man in the room wasn't at her table. He was sitting at his, alone. If a story like this belongs on your screen, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from tonight? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The reservation had been for 7:30. By 8:10, Evan Calloway had stopped looking at the door. Not because he'd given up, not exactly, but because there was only so many times a man could glance at the entrance of a restaurant before the gesture stopped meaning anything and started just being sad. The maitre d' had already given him one of those looks. Careful. Neutral. The professional kind of pity that expensive establishments trained their staff to deliver without anyone admitting it was pity at all. Evan turned his water glass in a slow circle on the white tablecloth. The ice had mostly melted. He hadn't ordered anything. Hadn't wanted to order anything, really, because ordering felt like a declaration I'm staying, and some part of him was still leaving the question open. Maybe traffic. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe there was a completely reasonable explanation that would arrive any minute and make this whole miserable evening turn into one of those stories couples told at dinner parties years later, laughing about it. He wasn't a fool. He knew she wasn't coming. He just hadn't quite talked himself into standing up yet. The restaurant was called Ardennes. His sister, Dana, had suggested was generous. She'd basically staged an intervention 3 weeks ago in his kitchen, while Milo sat in the next room watching cartoons at full volume. You need to try, Evan. You can't just disappear into your own apartment for the rest of your life. She'd made the reservation herself. She'd even described the woman Caroline, a graphic designer, recently divorced, no kids, funny in texts, pretty in her profile photo. Dana had been so pleased with herself. Evan had spent 20 minutes that evening trying to get a juice stain off his tie. He hadn't managed it completely. The tie now sat slightly crooked across his chest, the knot too thick, because he'd retied it 4 times in the car and still hadn't gotten it right. And there was a faint pale ghost of dried apple juice, about 3 inches from the bottom, that was only visible if the light caught it from the right angle. He'd worn the tie anyway. He didn't own that many. The suit itself was fine. He'd bought it 3 years ago for a colleague's wedding. It was the kind of suit that was designed to look acceptable in a photograph and unremarkable in person, and it did both of those things without complaint. It did not look like the suits the men around him were wearing. Those suits had a kind of weight to them, a presence. His suit was present, the way furniture in a waiting room was present. None of that had mattered when he'd left the apartment. It mattered now. At 8:15, the waiter, a young guy named Thomas, according to his name tag, who had perfected the art of approaching a solitary diner with maximum gentleness, came over for the 3rd time. Can I bring you anything while you wait? Sparkling water, perhaps, or something from the bar? Evan looked up. He stopped. Started over. I'm going to go ahead and get the check. Thomas nodded as though this was a completely ordinary thing to say and not a quiet little surrender. Of course, Evan reached for his coat on the back of the chair. That was when the chair across from him moved. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just moved. Scraped back from the table in a slow, deliberate arc, and then someone sat down in it, and Evan looked up from his coat with the expression of a man who had genuinely not predicted this particular development, which was the honest truth. The woman across from him was somewhere around 50. She wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than a month of Evan's rent, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested it had started the evening in a very precise arrangement, and was now, at this hour, slightly less precise, which somehow made her look more formidable rather than less. She set a glass of wine on the table, with the ease of someone who had always occupied exactly whatever space she chose to occupy. She studied him for a moment. Evan studied her back. Your date abandoned you, she said. Her voice was even. Not unkind, but not particularly cushioned either. I've been watching you wait for 40 minutes. That's Evan wasn't sure how to finish that sentence. Embarrassing felt accurate. Correct also felt accurate. Yeah, I just walked out of a corporate dinner. She didn't offer this as a confidence or a vulnerability. It was just information, stated plainly. 6 people at that table, and every single one of them was performing. By dessert, I wanted to pour my wine into a plant and leave. So I did. The wine or the dinner. Her mouth moved. Almost a smile. The dinner. I'm drinking the wine. Thomas had appeared again, with the supernatural timing of good waitstaff, and he looked between the two of them with an expression he was working very hard to keep professional. Evan looked at the woman across from him, realizing he had no idea what she wanted. He also had no idea who she was. She seemed like someone he should probably know, in the vague way that a person could seem important without the reason being immediately clear. Sparkling water, she said, and I'll look at the menu. Thomas left. Evan put his coat back on the chair. I don't actually know why you sat down, he said. Because the alternative was going home at 8:15 on a Thursday, and that seemed like losing. She picked up the menu, glanced at it briefly, set it back down. Why should they ruin the rest of our night? Both of us. They're not exactly. I mean, you chose to leave your dinner. I did. She looked at him directly. She had the kind of eye contact that didn't feel aggressive, but also didn't give ground. Your situation was less voluntary. Evan laughed. He hadn't meant to. It came out because it was true, and because there was something absurd about having this conversation at all in this restaurant on this particular evening. That's a polite way to say it. I'm told I'm occasionally polite. Only occasionally? I don't like to overpromise. Her name was Helena. She offered the last name Whitmore, the way people offered a last name when they were used to it meaning something, though she said it without any visible expectation that it would land with significance. It didn't for Evan. He caught it, filed it somewhere, and extended his own hand across the table. Evan Calloway. Evan. She shook his hand once firmly, released it. What do you do, Evan? Architecture. Junior level, I work for a firm downtown. Commercial design, mostly. A lot of office interiors. Do you like it? He considered the question. Most people asked it expecting yes and moved on. Parts of it. The problem-solving parts. Not the parts where you spend 6 weeks on a concept and the client decides in a 40-minute meeting that they want everything beige. Beige, she repeated. It happens more than you'd think. I believe you. What else? He looked at her. What else? What else do you do? Architecture can't be the whole sentence. This was a strange question for a first conversation with a stranger who had sat down uninvited at his table in a restaurant where he'd just been stood up. He would think about that later, the directness of it. The way she asked things like she actually wanted to know the answers, and wasn't just building toward a point about herself. I have a son, he's 6, his name is Milo. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Single father? Since he was 2. She was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, more like she was taking the information seriously rather than rushing to respond to it. That's a lot to carry. He shrugged, which wasn't really an answer, but he wasn't sure what the answer was. It's fine sounded like a lie. It's the hardest thing I've ever done sounded like a complaint, and he didn't feel like complaining about Milo to a stranger. It's my life. I don't really think about it as carrying anymore. Just the shape of things. Helena looked at him steadily. That's a good answer, is it? Better than the ones I usually get. Evan wasn't sure what that meant. He let it go. Thomas came back with the sparkling water and took their orders. Evan ordered something modest, the soup, the salmon, the second cheapest thing on the menu, with the careful internal calculation that he'd been doing, since he'd looked at the menu prices online that afternoon and done a quiet, private reckoning that he'd never admit to anyone. Helena ordered without looking at the menu again. They talked through the first course. Wasn't the way Evan had expected the evening to go sitting across from a woman he hadn't planned to meet, talking about architecture and child-rearing and whether the city's new transit development made any practical sense. They both agreed it didn't, though for different reasons. Helena argued infrastructure from a position of someone who had clearly spent time in enough cities to have actual comparative data. Evan argued it from the position of someone who took the subway every morning and knew exactly which platforms flooded when it rained. She listened when he talked, not nodding and waiting, but actually listening. It made him slightly self-conscious once he noticed it, which made him talk differently, more carefully. And then, when he caught himself being more careful, less carefully again. You went quiet, she observed. I was thinking about something. What? He debated whether to say it, then said it. You listen like you're actually paying attention. I am. Most people listen like they're waiting for their turn. Helena tilted her head slightly. Most people in my world listen like they're building a case. That sounds exhausting. It is. She said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. You stop noticing after a while. Then you're at dinner, and someone starts talking about a juice stain on his tie. Evan looked down at his tie. And you realize, she continued, that you haven't heard anyone say anything unrehearsed in longer than you can remember. He was quiet for a moment. It's apple juice, he said. My son, this afternoon, before the babysitter arrived. I tried to get it out. I know. You keep touching it. He hadn't realized he'd been doing that. He moved his hand away from the tie. How much does a babysitter cost? Helena asked. Tonight. It was a strange question. Not rude, just direct in a way that cut through a layer of the evening that Evan hadn't planned to discuss. Why? I'm curious about the actual arithmetic of your life. He looked at her for a second. $50. She charges $15 an hour. So every hour we sit here costs you $15. Plus the meal, yeah. Helena said nothing for a moment. Then we should probably make it worth the money. Evan laughed again the second time that evening, which was already more than he'd expected when he'd left the apartment, and something in the conversation loosened after that. The way things loosened when both people stopped being careful at exactly the same time. He told her about Milo's obsession with dinosaurs. Not just the common ones, the T-Rex, the Triceratops, the ones on lunchboxes, but the obscure ones. Milo could tell you the difference between a Carnotaurus and a Ceratosaurus at 6 years old, and would correct anyone who got it wrong, including his kindergarten teacher, which had led to a parent-teacher conference that Evan still wasn't entirely sure had been resolved in anyone's favor. Helena's mouth curved, a real smile this time, not the careful almost one from before. He sounds formidable. He's terrifying, Evan said, and meant it as a compliment. She told him, briefly and without much detail, about the company she ran. An investment firm. Large. He gathered large in the way that her tone shifted slightly when she said it, the careful neutrality of someone describing something that other people tended to react to. He nodded and asked what kind of investments, and she seemed mildly surprised that this was his follow-up question. Infrastructure, primarily. Some tech. Real estate development. Any architecture firms? A few. Nothing residential. Pity. He said it without thinking. That's where the interesting problems are. She looked at him. Why interesting? Because residential design is about how people actually live. Commercial design is about how people project that they work. He paused. Sorry. That's probably not no, she said. Keep going. He did. He talked about a project he'd been pushing at the firm Affordable Family Housing with actual attention paid to light and communal space, instead of just cubic footage efficiency. His bosses hadn't been enthusiastic. The margins weren't there, they said. Evan thought the margins weren't the point, which was exactly the kind of thinking that kept him at junior level, according to his bosses. He said all of this, and then stopped and looked across the table and noticed that Helena Whitmore was watching him with the same focused attention she'd been giving him all evening, and it occurred to him, suddenly and rather forcefully, that he had no idea who she actually was. He'd caught the name. He'd caught investment firm and large. He hadn't connected them to anything specific because he wasn't someone who tracked that world. He knew buildings. He knew Milo's school schedule and the transit map, and which grocery store had the best prices on the specific brand of frozen waffles that Milo ate every morning without variation. He didn't know who Helena Whitmore was, and she, it seemed, understood this perfectly. By the time the check arrived, they'd been at the table for nearly 2 hours. Thomas brought the bill without being asked, because Thomas was good at his job. Evan reached for it out of reflex, checked the total, and kept his face very still. Helena moved the check toward herself. You don't have to, he started. I know I don't have to. She glanced at the amount, set her card on the folder without blinking at a number that Evan's face had needed a full second to process. You can argue with me if you'd like, but you're paying a babysitter by the hour. He wanted to argue. He understood that arguing would be the right thing to do, the dignified thing, the thing that a man with any pride would do. He also understood that the number on that check was going to take him 3 weeks to recover from if he put it on his card tonight. He didn't argue. Thank you, he said instead. She looked up. You mean it? Yes. Something in her expression shifted barely, just at the edges. Like she'd been waiting to see whether he'd perform gratitude or feel it. And she'd gotten her answer, and it had surprised her a little. You're welcome, she said. They gathered their coats. The restaurant had thinned out around them, the couples and business dinners winding down, the evening tilting toward late. Evan helped Helena with her coat without thinking about it, just because he was closer to it, and she let him, which also seemed to require a small internal adjustment on her part. "I should find my driver," she said. Evan nodded. They walked toward the door, and the maitre d' said goodnight with the particular warmth that establishments reserved for people who had significantly above average, and they stepped out into the city air, which was cold and sharp and immediate in the way that nighttime cities were, all noise and light and distance. Evan looked at this woman, who had sat down across from him and turned a completely wrecked evening into something he couldn't quite name yet. He still didn't know who she was. He thought for a half-second about asking for her number. Then he thought about Milo at home, probably already asleep, and the babysitter checking her watch, and the $15 per hour ticking quietly in the background of everything. This was he started. "Unexpected," she said. "That's the word." She almost smiled again. "Good night, Evan." "Good night, Helena." Car was waiting at the curb, a long, dark thing, with a driver who stepped out before she'd reached the sidewalk. She moved toward it without looking back. Evan watched until the car merged into traffic and disappeared, then stood there another moment in the cold, alone on the sidewalk outside the most expensive restaurant he'd ever eaten in without actually paying for the meal. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, called the babysitter to let her know he was on his way. And the whole ride home, on the subway, in the cold, he couldn't figure out who Helena Whitmore was, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd listened. Like what he said actually mattered. Like she hadn't decided the answer before he'd finished the sentence. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He hadn't realized until tonight how much he'd missed it. He didn't look her up that night. That was the first thing. He got home, paid the babysitter, a college junior named Priya, who lived 2 floors up, and had the particular gift of being both reliable and unbothered by Milo's habit of conducting full-volume dinosaur lectures at unpredictable hours, and then stood in his kitchen for a while, eating the leftover half of a sandwich he'd made that afternoon, and didn't remember leaving in the fridge. The apartment was quiet, the way apartments got quiet when a 6-year-old was asleep in the next room, which was a specific and particular quiet that still felt slightly unreal to Evan after 4 years of it. Not empty, just held. He thought about looking her up. He didn't. It wasn't principle. Exactly. It was more that the evening had felt like something complete in itself, a strange, accidental thing that had happened, and that he wasn't ready to dismantle with information. If he searched her name and found out she was exactly as significant as her car and her suit, and the way the restaurant staff had moved around her, Sex suggested, then the whole thing would rearrange itself in his memory into something different. A story about a powerful woman who'd briefly entertained herself with a regular person. He'd had enough of that feeling for one night. So he finished the sandwich, checked on Milo sleeping on his back with one arm flung over the edge of the bed, small plastic ankylosaurus tucked under his chin, which was a new thing, and went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well. In the morning, Milo wanted waffles, which was not a surprise, and wanted to know why Evan looked tired, which was also not a surprise because Milo had the observational instincts of a small, relentless detective and had been this way since approximately age 4. "I didn't sleep great," Evan said. "Was it the date?" Milo asked, entirely without tact, because tact was not yet in his repertoire. Evan looked at his son. "Dana told you about the date. She said you were going on a date and you looked scared." "I wasn't scared. You look scared sometimes when you think I'm not looking." Evan put a waffle in the toaster and didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't a good answer that was also honest and also appropriate for a 6-year-old at 7 in the morning. "Was she nice?" Milo asked. The date didn't really. Evan stopped. "It's complicated." Milo considered this. "Did she not like dinosaurs?" "I don't know. We didn't get to that." "That's bad," Milo said with complete seriousness. That's an important thing to know about a person." Evan had to agree that it was probably important. He dropped Milo at school, went to work, sat through a 2-hour meeting about a commercial lobby redesign in which a client said the word dynamic 14 times in reference to a floor plan that was, by any objective measure, a rectangle. He drew small, careful boxes in the margin of his notepad while the meeting ran long. He thought, periodically, about Franklin's Diner, which was 3 blocks from his office. That was what Helena had said the night before, "Take me somewhere ordinary." She'd said it standing outside Ardennes while her driver waited at the curb, and Evan had been so off balance from the whole evening that he'd answered honestly, "I know a diner." She'd said, "Perfect." He'd assumed she was being polite. She had not been being polite. He found out exactly how not polite she'd been 2 days later, because that was how long it took for him to look her up. He'd caved on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting at his desk with a half-eaten granola bar and a search engine, and the specific kind of curiosity that had finally worn through his resistance. Helena Whitmore, 50 years old, founder and CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, a private investment firm with holdings across infrastructure, commercial real estate, technology, and several other sectors that took Evan a few minutes to fully absorb. The firm managed assets somewhere in the range of figures that required him to count the zeros twice to make sure he was reading correctly. There were photographs, formal ones, mostly. Board meetings, industry conferences, a magazine profile from 3 years ago, with a headline about women who had reshaped the financial landscape. She looked the same in the photographs as she had across the table from him. Composed, direct, completely at ease with being the most significant person in the room. He sat with that for a while. He'd had soup and salmon with her. He'd told her about Milo's kindergarten teacher standoff over dinosaur taxonomy. He'd complained about his bosses preferring margins over design integrity. She'd listened to all of it with the same focused attention, and he hadn't known, he genuinely hadn't known, and she'd understood that and hadn't corrected it. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about it on the subway home. By the time he was making dinner, he'd decided that the most sensible course of action was to forget the whole thing. Not cruelly, just realistically. Helena Whitmore did not need anything from his particular corner of the world, and he had a grocery budget and a school schedule, and a son who needed an ankylosaurus replaced because the tail had finally snapped off, and that was his life, and it was enough. He'd almost completely talked himself into this when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. The diner you mentioned, Franklin's. I looked it up. Is it as good as the fries suggest, or are you one of those people who oversells local places to seem relatable? He read it twice. He typed back, "Who is this A pause?" Then Helena, another pause, slightly longer. Then you didn't look me up. It wasn't a question. He thought about how she would know that. He thought about the fact that he'd only looked her up today, and she'd apparently been waiting to see whether he would, and now she knew he hadn't done it immediately. "I looked you up today," he wrote back. And he thought about what to say. He typed several things and deleted them. Eventually he wrote, "The zeros were alarming. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then they alarm most people. They didn't seem to alarm you. I've had 20 years to get used to them." Evan sat in his kitchen, phone in hand, aware that this was the moment where the sensible thing and the actual thing were two completely different things. He typed, "The fries are genuinely good, not overselling." Her response came back in under a minute Friday. He wrote, "That's not a question." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he texted Priya about Friday. Franklin's Diner existed in that particular category of New York establishment that had survived 60 years of neighborhood change through sheer stubbornness and the loyalty of regulars who would follow it through a flood. It occupied a corner slot on a side street that most people in the neighborhood walked past without registering, unless they already knew it was there, at which point it became the only thing they could see. The booths were red vinyl, cracked along the seams in patterns that had been cracking since roughly 1987. The lighting was the specific amber of places that had never updated their fixtures. The menu was laminated and slightly sticky, and had photographs of approximately 40 different items, most of which involved eggs in some configuration. Evan got there first on Friday and took the booth in the back corner, which had the best sight lines to the door, and also a slight lean to the table that you had to account for when setting down a mug if you didn't want it to drift. Helena came in at 7 exactly. She was wearing different clothes than the charcoal suit, dark jeans, a cream-colored top, a coat that was still clearly expensive but less formally so. Her hair was down. She looked around the diner the way someone looked around, a place they'd been curious about, taking it in without performing the taking in, and then she found him in the back and crossed the restaurant with the same directness she'd crossed the dining room at Ardennes 4 days ago. She slid into the booth. "Okay," she said, looking around again. "I understand. The fries?" "The whole thing." She picked up the menu, looked at the photographs. "This is someone's actual favorite place." "It was my father's," Evan said. "He used to bring me here when I was a kid. After he moved out, we'd come here on Sundays. Helena looked at him. He hadn't planned to say that it had come out because the diner had a way of loosening things, which was probably why his father had chosen it. Neutral ground. A place where things felt smaller in a useful way. I bring Milo here, he added. He orders chocolate milk and takes the pickles off his burger and lines them up on the edge of the plate. And I used to try to get him to eat them, and now I've given up. So we just sit there with this little line of pickles. Corner of Helena's mouth moved. How many pickles? 3, usually. Sometimes 4 if he's feeling ambitious. Martha, the woman who'd been working weekend and Friday evenings at Franklin's for as long as Evan had been coming, appeared at the table with 2 mugs and the coffee pot already in hand. She looked at Helena the way she looked at most people Evan brought to the diner, which was with a careful and comprehensive appraisal delivered over roughly 3 seconds. Coffee? Martha asked. Please, Helena said. Martha poured without further comment and disappeared. Helena wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the coffee with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to a very different quality of coffee and had decided, actively, not to hold this against it. She took a sip. It's terrible, she said. It's famously terrible. I've had coffee in 40 countries. This is comfortably in the bottom 5. That's actually impressive, Evan said. I think they've been using the same beans since the Clinton administration. She laughed. It was a different laugh than the careful, controlled expression she'd deployed at Ardennes Shorter, more genuine, slightly surprised by itself. She looked briefly younger when she laughed, and then the expression settled back and she was 50 again, which was fine, because 50 suited her in the way that some people wore their age, like a fact they'd made peace with. They ordered. Helena ordered the fries, as promised, and a burger, which she'd studied on the laminated menu with the same focus Evan had seen her apply to everything else. He ordered the same. Martha brought them their food without ceremony, set the plates down like she was completing a transaction, rather than providing a service, which was exactly right for the diner. Helena looked at the plate in front of her. These are enormous, she said. Yeah. She picked up a fry, ate it, considered. Okay, she said. I was wrong to doubt you. The fries don't lie. No. She ate another one. What does Milo order here? And they were back in it, the same way they'd been at Ardennes talking, actually talking, in the way that Evan had forgotten was possible with someone he'd only just met. He told her about Milo's current phase, which involved both dinosaurs and an intense interest in whether the moon was actually on fire, which it was not. But Milo had a friend at school who had stated this with great confidence, and Milo was keeping the question open pending further evidence. Helena found this genuinely funny and didn't pretend otherwise. She told him things too. Not the things from the magazine profile, those were already public, available to anyone with a search engine, but the other things. That she'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Baltimore with her mother and an older brother, and that her mother had worked double shifts at a hospital administration desk and had still somehow made dinner most nights, and that watching her mother do that had taught Helena more about resource management than any MBA program. That she'd started the firm at 31 with a combination of savings, a small loan, and a level of confidence she now recognized as partially delusional in the best possible way. That she hadn't taken a vacation in 4 years. Not because she couldn't, but because she'd stopped being able to locate the version of herself that would have enjoyed one. What would you do, Evan asked, if you took one? I have no idea. She said it plainly. That's the problem. You could start with bad coffee and good fries. She looked at him across the table. I appear to be doing that. The diner filled up around them the Friday evening crowd, a mix of regulars and younger people who'd found the place on some neighborhood app, a family with 2 kids in the booth near the front who were conducting some negotiation about dessert that was getting progressively louder. Helena noticed the family without making a thing of it. She watched them the way she watched most things with attention she didn't advertise. You ever wish it was different? She asked. What? Being alone. Doing it alone. Evan looked at his coffee mug. The question was direct enough that it deserved a direct answer, and he thought about giving her a measured one, the kind he gave people who asked about Milo's mother with the careful, interested faces of people who mostly wanted a story. He decided against it. Every day, he said, some days more than others. But if you're asking whether I wish I hadn't had Milo, I'm not asking that. No, yeah, I know, he set the mug down. It's hard to separate. He's the reason I'm doing it alone, and he's also the reason it's worth doing. Those two things live in the same place. She was quiet for a moment. That's honest. You asked an honest question. Most people don't answer honestly. I'm not most people. No, she said, you're not. There was a moment after that where neither of them said anything, and the diner noise filled the space, the family negotiation at the front table. Martha calling something through the window to the kitchen, scrape of a chair nearby. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that settled between two people who had temporarily run out of words and were fine with it. Then Helena reached across the table and stole one of his fries. He looked at her. You have more than me, she said, without any apology in it. I do not have more than you. Count them. He didn't count them. She ate the fry with complete composure. He pushed the plate toward the middle of the table. They split the fries. Martha came by and refilled the coffee without being asked. They talked about the city's development projects, which Evan had opinions about from an architectural standpoint, and Helena had opinions about from an investment standpoint, and their opinions overlapped in some places, and disagreed sharply in others, and disagreeing with her was, Evan found, not uncomfortable. She didn't take it personally. She didn't back down unless she actually thought he was right, and when she did think he was right, she said so directly, without making a production of conceding. It was, he thought, the clearest conversation he'd had with another adult in a long time that wasn't about Miles' school or his firm's billing cycles or Dana's ongoing efforts to reorganize his life. At 9:15, he checked his phone, not anxiously, just a reflex. Priya was fine. Milo had gone to bed at 8:30 without incident, which Priya had to text with 2 exclamation points because it was unusual enough to warrant them. Helena watched him check the phone. He's okay? She asked. Yeah, he's asleep. What time does he wake up? 6:30. On days he's excited about something. What's he excited about this weekend? Evan thought about it. There's a thing at the Natural History Museum. Dinosaur exhibit. I told him we'd go Saturday. Helena looked at him. You're tired, she said. Not as an accusation, just as an observation. I'm fine. You've been awake since 6:30. You worked all day. You're having coffee that's roughly the quality of hot ditch water. I made a choice, he said. She studied him. Then she said carefully, Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things all night. This one's different. A pause. When did you last do something? Just because you wanted to. Not for Milo. Not for the firm. Just for yourself. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out immediately. Don't say tonight, she added. You came here tonight partially because you were curious and partially because you felt like you owed me the benefit of the doubt. That's very specific. Am I wrong? He thought about it. No. So when? The honest answer was that he couldn't remember. He'd been through long enough stretches of grocery budgets and school pickups and late nights reworking plans that the clients rejected anyway, that the question itself felt slightly theoretical. Like being asked to describe a color he'd seen once years ago in different light. I don't know, he said. Helena didn't push it, didn't offer a solution or a reframe. She just nodded once, like that was an answer she'd been expecting and had decided to sit with rather than fix. That was the thing about her. Evan was starting to understand. She didn't try to fix things she hadn't been asked to fix. She just paid attention. They stayed until Martha started wiping down the tables around them, with the pointed efficiency of a woman who was not going to say we're closing, but was very clearly thinking it. Evan left a tip that was generous relative to his budget, which he did every time he came here because his father had taught him that, and it had stuck. Helena noticed she noticed most things but didn't comment. Outside, the city was doing what it did on Friday nights, which was being loud and bright and indifferent to individuals in the way that cities were indifferent, that enormous collective hum of everyone having their own evening simultaneously. Her car was at the curb. He'd expected that. He hadn't expected her to pause on the sidewalk. I want to ask you something else, she said. Another one. Last one tonight. She looked at him steadily. Why haven't you asked me anything about the money? He thought about the question. What would I ask? Most people want to know how it works, what it's like, whether it changes things. She said it without defensiveness, just documentation. They get curious in a particular way. I'm curious about other things. Like what? Like why you walked out of your dinner on Tuesday and sat down at a stranger's table. He looked at her. The money seems like the least interesting thing about you. She was quiet for a moment. The car idled at the curb. A cab went by. Nobody's said that to me in a long time, she said. Said what? That. She didn't specify further. She didn't need to. Evan looked at her for a moment. I'll say it again whenever it applies. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, not guarded, not open, something in the middle that suggested she was working something out internally and wasn't sure of the answer yet. Then she moved toward the car. Saturday, she said, without turning around. What about Saturday? She paused with her hand on the door. You said the Natural History Museum. What time? He blinked. Helena, I'm asking what time. She turned slightly. I haven't been to the Natural History Museum in 15 years. I used to like the blue whale. Milo, well, he stopped. He's going to have opinions, I assumed. He's going to tell you everything that's wrong about the dinosaur exhibits. I look forward to it. Evan stood on the sidewalk and tried to find the part of this that was a bad idea. He could identify several components that should, theoretically, constitute a bad idea. Couldn't locate the feeling of it being one. 10 o'clock, he said. She nodded once. Got in the car. He watched it go. Then he stood there another moment in the Friday night noise, hands in his coat pockets, thinking about a 50-year-old billionaire who hadn't been to the Natural History Museum in 15 years and missed the blue whale, and his 6-year-old son who would absolutely, without question, tell her everything that was wrong with the fossil labeling methodology in the main hall. He pulled out his phone, texted Priya to let her know he was on his way. Then he typed a message to Dana. The date stood me up. 3 seconds later, I know, I'm so sorry. She texted me an excuse that. It's fine, he wrote back. Something else happened. A longer pause. Then Evan. What did you do? He put the phone in his pocket and walked toward the subway. He didn't answer her until the next morning, because some things deserve to be thought about first, and some things deserve to be kept close for a little while before they got handed to other people's reactions. He'd forgotten that feeling too. The feeling of something that was just his, at least for one more night. Milo didn't know who Helena was. That was the thing Evan kept coming back to on Saturday morning while he was making waffles, and Milo was sitting at the kitchen table with a dinosaur encyclopedia, the size of a small brick, cross-referencing something with the focused intensity that 6-year-olds applied exclusively to things they cared about deeply. Milo didn't know who Helena Whitmore was. He didn't know about Whitmore Capital Group, or the asset figures, or the magazine profile, or the car that materialized at curbs before she'd finished walking toward them. He didn't have any of that information, and it wouldn't have meant anything to him if he did. Milo was going to evaluate Helena Whitmore entirely on her own merits, as he understood merits, which meant she would be assessed on whether she was interesting, and whether she was honest, and whether she knew anything about dinosaurs. Evan suspected she was going to fail the last one spectacularly. He told Milo, over waffles, that someone was meeting them at the museum. A friend. A woman named Helena who Evan had met recently. He'd kept it simple because simple was the right register for a 6-year-old on a Saturday morning, and also because he didn't entirely know what else to say. Milo had processed this information while eating his second waffle and then asked, without looking up from it, does she know about dinosaurs? I don't know, Evan said. Does she seem like someone who would? Evan thought about Helena in the diner booth, eating fries with the composed focus of someone who applied genuine attention to everything they did. I honestly can't tell. Milo considered this. We'll find out, he said with the tone of someone who had handled uncertainties before and emerged fine. They took the subway uptown, which Milo loved because the express trains made a sound between stations that he had decided, at age 4, was the train thinking, and he had never fully revised this position. He sat next to Evan with the ankylosaurus in his jacket pocket, the new one, ordered online 3 days after the tail snapped off the old one. Slightly different shade of green, but otherwise acceptable, and watched the tunnel go by. What's her last name? Milo asked. Whitmore. Helena Whitmore. He tried it out. That sounds like a person in a movie. She's not in a movie. I know, I'm just saying. He looked back at the tunnel. Is she nice? I think so. Yeah, you think so? Evan paused. She's honest. Sometimes more honest than you expect. Milo seemed to find this acceptable. He didn't ask anything else. Helena was waiting at the museum steps when they arrived, which Evan had not expected. He'd half anticipated the car pulling up at 10:05 with an apologetic explanation about traffic, but she was already there, standing near the top of the steps in a coat that was slightly more casual than the Ardennes charcoal suit, and considerably more casual than anything the magazine profile had photographed her in. She was looking at something on her phone, and she looked up when she heard them on the steps, and she did something that Evan would think about later. She put the phone in her pocket before they reached her. Not mid-sentence, not after finishing whatever she was reading. She just put it away and gave them her attention. Milo looked up at her from approximately 3 feet below eye level. Helena looked down at him. "You're Milo," she said. "You're Helena Whitmore," Milo said. "That sounds like a person in a movie." "Does a little," she agreed. "Dad said you're honest." Helena glanced at Evan, very briefly, with an expression that suggested she found this characterization both accurate and slightly amusing. "Your dad's generous. He said sometimes more honest than you expect. Also accurate." Milo appeared to have completed his initial assessment. He turned toward the museum doors. "The Titanosaurus is inside," he said. "It doesn't fit, so they have to put part of its neck in the hallway." "It's 72 feet long, I know," Helena said. Milo stopped, turned back. This was apparently significant. "You know about the Titanosaur? Patagotian majorum. Discovered in Argentina. They cast the bones because the originals are too fragile to display." She said it evenly, without showing off, just as information she happened to have. "I read about it when they installed the exhibit." Milo stared at her for a moment with the expression of someone radically revising an initial estimate. Then he turned and walked through the doors, and his pace had quickened. Evan looked at Helena. "I did some reading last night," she said. "How much reading?" "Enough." They went inside. The Natural History Museum on a Saturday morning was its own specific kind of organized chaos. School groups, moving in coordinated clusters, families with strollers that took up the width of the hallway, small children running in the peripheral vision of parents who were managing the particular exhaustion of trying to make a cultural experience feel fun. Evan knew the museum well enough to navigate it efficiently, which was the only way to navigate it. He knew which elevators were faster, which bathrooms had the shorter lines, which angles of the whale room Milo liked best. Milo went directly to the 4th floor, which was where the dinosaurs were, because for Milo, the museum had exactly one floor that mattered, and the rest were context. He walked Helena through the hall of Saurischian dinosaurs with the focus of someone who had prepared for this. He corrected 2 of the exhibit labels not loudly, not for performance, just as factual amendments he felt should be noted. He explained, at length, the difference between an Allosaurus and a Ceratosaurus and why people got them confused, which they shouldn't, because the differences were obvious if you looked at the skull structure. Helena listened. Not in the patient, waiting for the child to finish way that adults often listen to children. She actually listened, and when she asked a question, it was a real question. "What makes the Carnotaurus different from the others in this family?" she asked in front of the relevant display case. Milo looked up at her with an expression that was 3 parts suspicion and 1 part excitement, which was the expression he wore whenever he thought someone might actually be interested. "The horns," he said, "and the arms are even smaller than T. Rex, almost vestigial." Vestigial's a big word. I know what it means. "I didn't say you didn't." Helena crouched slightly so she was closer to his eye level in front of the case. "What do you think the horns were for?" "Display, probably. Like to look scary." "Nobody's sure. Uncertain evidence." "You know how to hold uncertainty." Milo blinked. "What?" "Some things we know. Some things we have good guesses about. Some things we're still waiting on evidence for. Knowing the difference matters." She looked at the display case. Most adults forget that part. Milo was quiet for a moment. He looked at Evan with an expression that Evan recognized the expression of a child who had encountered something unexpected from an adult and didn't quite know what to do with it yet. Then he looked back at Helena. "The horns might also have been for fighting each other," he said. "Like competition for mates. That's possible too." "It's probably both." "Usually is," Helena said. They moved through the hall. Evan walked slightly behind them, which was not a position he'd planned to occupy, but which felt right Milo navigating. Helena following, the 2 of them conducting what was, by any reasonable assessment, a fairly serious conversation about Cretaceous paleontology at 10:45 on a Saturday morning. He watched Helena crouch to Milo's level twice more without being asked. He watched her not check her phone. He watched her ask questions that demonstrated she'd done genuine reading the night before, not performative reading, and the difference was apparent to Milo even if Milo wouldn't have described it in those terms. What Milo would have said and did say. Eventually, when they reached the blue whale room and stood under the enormous model suspended from the ceiling was, "I think she's okay, Dad." He said it quietly, not because he was trying to be discreet, but because the whale room had a specific quality to it that made people lower their voices. Helena was a few feet away, looking up at the whale with an expression that was unguarded, in a way Evan hadn't seen before. Not composed, not managing anything. Just looking at a very large thing with something that was almost uncomplicated. Yeah? Evan said. She knows stuff, Milo said. And she doesn't pretend not to know when she doesn't know. She just says she doesn't know. When did she say she didn't know? I asked her what she thought the juvenile diplodocus would have weighed, and she said she didn't know and asked me what the research said. He paused. Mr. Patterson at school always makes something up when he doesn't know. It's obvious. Evan looked at Helena, still looking at the whale. Yeah, he said. She does that. The not pretending thing. Yeah. Milo seemed satisfied. He went to stand beside Helena and look at the whale, and after a moment he said, "It's 94 feet long. It's the largest animal that's ever lived." I remember, Helena said. I used to come here when I was first starting my company. When things were going badly, I'd come and stand under it. Milo looked up at her. Why? Because it helped me remember that I was very small and very new, and that most problems were smaller than they felt. She looked down at him. Does that make sense? Milo thought about it. Kind of like how dinosaurs are old and we're new? Exactly like that. He looked back at the whale. I think that's smart, he said. Helena looked at the whale too. Evan decided quietly that whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. They had lunch at the museum cafe, which was overpriced and crowded, and Milo had a hot dog that he ate with the systematic focus he applied to meals he actually liked. Helena had a coffee that she assessed as marginally better than Franklin's, which Evan disputed. Milo mediated by declaring that he didn't drink coffee and therefore had no opinion, which was the correct position for a 6-year-old. The afternoon changed things, not in the way of a dramatic shift, no moment where something announced itself. Just the gradual realization, somewhere between the cafe and the Hall of Ocean Life and the subway ride home, that a line had been crossed from this is a strange and unexpected situation to this is a situation that has its own internal logic now. Milo fell asleep on the subway, which he did sometimes on the way back from big days, slumped against Evan's arm with the ankylosaurus still in his jacket pocket and his sneakers barely reaching the seat edge. Evan and Helena sat side by side in the relative quiet of the early afternoon car, which was not crowded, and talked in the low register that sleeping children required. He's going to wake up and want a snack, Evan said. What kind? Depends on the day. Probably something specific that we don't have and I'll have to improvise. Helena watched Milo for a moment, not in a way that was intrusive. More the way adults watched sleeping children, a combination of something tender and something almost envious, the cleanness of a small person sleeping without any complicated architecture holding the sleep together. Does he ever ask about his mother? She asked, quietly. Evan considered whether to answer. He always considered whether to answer that question, because the answer had a shape that people didn't expect. Sometimes, less than he used to, he looked at his son. She left when he was 2. It's not he doesn't really have memories of her. He has the idea of her, and sometimes he asks about the idea. What do you tell him? The truth in pieces, age-appropriate pieces. He paused. That she wasn't ready, that it wasn't about him, that some people leave not because of who you are, but because of who they are, and that doesn't have anything to do with his value. Helena was quiet. He accepts it better than you'd think, Evan said. Kids are. He thought about how to say it. They're more adaptable than we give them credit for. They accept the reality in front of them. He's adapted to a reality where it's him and me, and that's mostly fine. And then occasionally he asks a question that reminds me that it's not entirely fine, and we work through it. What questions? Evan thought about the most recent one. From 2 months ago, on a Tuesday night after bath time, when Milo had been standing in the hallway in his pajamas and had asked, with the directness of someone who'd been thinking about something for a while and had finally decided to just say it, "Do you think she thinks about me?" He didn't tell Helena that specific one, but he said the ones that don't have good answers. The train went underground again, and the car got briefly louder. Milo shifted slightly and stayed asleep. You're good at it, Helena said. At what? Raising him. Anyone who spends 20 minutes with him can see that. Evan looked at the window across the car, the darkness of the tunnel reflecting the car back at them. I make a lot of it up, he said. I don't know what I'm doing any more than anyone else does. I just show up. Every day. That's mostly it. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not. She shifted slightly in the seat. Not toward him, not away. Just a small adjustment that changed the proximity between them, by a few inches, which in the context of a subway car with a sleeping child between them was more significant than it would have been otherwise. "I have a board meeting Monday," she said, changing register. 12 people in a room who've all decided in advance what they want out of the meeting and will spend 2 hours negotiating it without saying so directly. "Sounds like my office." "Every office," she agreed. "At least yours has interesting problems. Mine is mostly the same 3 arguments restructured every quarter." "What are the arguments?" "Risk tolerance, time horizons. Who gets credit for what?" She said it with a flatness that was not resignation, but something more like familiarity, a woman who had been having these arguments long enough that they'd lost the power to surprise her. "I started the company because I wanted to build things. Infrastructure, development, actual physical things that changed how people moved and lived. Now I spend most of my time managing the people who manage those things, and the managing has become the whole job. Do you want to change that?" She looked at him sideways. "I don't know. Changing it would mean trusting other people to make decisions I've been making myself for 20 years. Is that the hard part?" "The hard part," she said, "is that most of the time, the decisions I've been making are fine. Not brilliant. Fine. And someone else would make fine decisions too, and I know that, and I still can't make myself let go of them." Evan thought about that. "Control," he said, "yes. Because you built it from nothing." "Because I built it from nothing," she confirmed. "When you build something from nothing, every piece of it feels like it's made of something you gave out of yourself. And you're afraid that if you stop holding it, it'll come apart. Will it?" She was quiet for a moment. "Probably not. But you're not sure. But I'm not sure." The train slowed for their stop. Milo woke up with the gradual, blinking confusion of a child returning from deep sleep, looked around, identified that they were on the subway and that everything was where he'd left it, and said, "Are we home?" Almost Evan said. Milo looked across Evan at Helena. He'd forgotten she was there for approximately seconds and now remembered. "Are you coming to our apartment?" Milo Evan started. "I'm not," Helena said. "Not today." Milo accepted this without argument. Train stopped. They filed out onto the platform. Outside the station, the afternoon had turned gray, the specific gray of the city in late October when the sky lowered itself like a lid, and the air had the smell of rain that hadn't decided to happen yet. Milo walked ahead of them on the sidewalk with the purposeful energy of a child who knew where he was going, and Evan and Helena walked behind him at the slightly slower pace of adults, who were in less of a hurry. Corner near Evan's building, Helena's car was already there. Evan had not seen her call it. He didn't know when she'd done it. He looked at the car and then at her, and he said the thing that he'd been circling around for 3 days. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Whatever this is. I don't know how it works, the logistics of it. I don't know how it fits." He wasn't being self-deprecating. He was being factual, which was the only register he knew how to operate in when something mattered. "I'm 32, and I have a 6-year-old, and I work junior-level hours for junior-level pay, and I've been on exactly one date in the past 2 years, which was the date that stood me up and led to you sitting down, so my reference points are limited." "I'm aware of your reference point," she said. "I'm not finished." She waited again. "He comes first," Evan said. He nodded toward Milo, who had reached the building entrance and was examining something on the sidewalk near the door, a crack, probably, or an insect, or some piece of the world that required immediate investigation. "Always. I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to reshape it because things get complicated. Whatever this is, it has to exist in the same world as him." Helena looked at Milo, then at Evan. "I'm not asking you to apologize for it," she said. "I know. But I needed to say it directly, so it's been said. Then it's been said." She looked at him steadily. "Can I say something now?" "Yes. I'm not here because this is simple," she said. "I've done simple. Simple is a man who wants a connection to my company or my capital or my influence, and he makes himself agreeable, and I find him boring by the 3rd meeting. This is not that." She said it without heat. Just as a statement of fact, the way she stated most things. "I'm aware of the distance between our lives. I'm not pretending it doesn't exist. Then what are you doing?" She looked at him for a moment before answering. "I'm finding out whether the distance matters more than the other things." "What other things?" "The fact that you talk to me like I'm a person," she said. "Not a position, not a resource, not a negotiation." Pause. "You have no idea how rare that is." Evan looked at her. He believed her. He'd seen enough of how people oriented themselves around her in the past week, the specific alertness that came into people's posture when they realized who she was, the way conversation shifted to understand that she wasn't exaggerating. "I'm just talking to you," he said. "I know." Something moved across her face. Milo had given up on whatever he'd been examining and was now standing at the building entrance, looking back at them with the patient impatience of a child who had decided the adult conversation was taking longer than necessary. "Dad," he called. Not urgently. "Just locating 1 minute," Evan called back. He looked at Helena. She looked at him. And then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a business card, looked at it for a second, and then put it back in her pocket. "I was going to give you this," she said. "And then I thought you already know how to reach me. You texted me. You called me." She held his gaze. "If there's a next time, I want it to be because you decided on your own terms. Not because I handed you a card and made it easy." Evan understood what she was doing. She was removing the architecture of obligation. She was making the next step entirely his. "That's either very confident or very uncertain," he said. "Both," she said, at the same time. "That's usually how it works." She moved toward the car. The driver had the door open before she reached it. Paused. "Tell Milo that the Carnotaurus questioned the horns. I looked it up last night. Current research leans toward both display and intraspecific combat. He was right to hold both possibilities. I'll tell him. He'll want a source, probably. I'll text it to you." She got in the car. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb with the quiet efficiency of well-maintained machinery, and Evan watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared into the Saturday afternoon traffic. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Milo appeared beside him. "Is she gone?" Milo asked. "Yeah, is she coming back?" Evan looked at the corner where the car had turned. He thought about a woman who had walked out of a corporate dinner and sat down at a stranger's table. He thought about her putting her phone away before they'd reached the museum steps. He thought about her crouching to Milo's eye level in front of the Carnotaurus display and asking a real question. He thought about both and at the same time, and that's usually how it works. "I think so," he said. Milo nodded. He seemed to find this satisfactory. He went through the building door. Evan followed. Upstairs, while he was making the snack that turned out to be apple slices and peanut butter, which he did have, Milo sat at the kitchen table with the dinosaur encyclopedia open again and said, without looking up, "She's different from other grown-ups." "How so?" "She listens like she's actually interested. Not like she's waiting for me to stop." He turned a page, and she didn't make the face. Evan looked at him. "What face?" "The face grown-ups make when they're trying to seem interested in what a kid is saying, but actually they're thinking about something else." He demonstrated it briefly, a slightly fixed, pleasant expression with absent eyes. It was a distressingly accurate impression of approximately 30% of the adults Evan knew. She didn't do that. Evan put the apple slices on a plate. "No," he said. She didn't. That night after Milo was in bed, Evan sat on the couch with his phone and thought about what she'd said on the sidewalk. Card back in the pocket. "If there's a next time, I want it to be because you decided." He thought about the arithmetic of his life, the babysitter hours, the grocery budgets, the junior-level salary, the lease that came up for renewal in March and made him nervous every year. He thought about the distance she'd named, and the things she'd said existed on the other side of the distance, and whether those things were enough to bridge it, or whether they were just the things you told yourself when you wanted them to be. He thought about Milo saying, "She listens like she's actually interested." He thought about standing under the blue whale and watching her face go unguarded. He picked up his phone. He went to her name and his contacts. He looked at it for a moment. He typed, "Milo wants to know your source on the Carnotaurus horn research." 3 minutes later, a link arrived. And then below it, "I was going to wait to see how long you'd wait." He wrote back, "How long did you think I'd wait?" Her reply came quickly, and it was 3 words. And they were the most direct 3 words she'd said to him yet, which for a woman of her particular directness was saying something not very long. He set his phone down on the cushion beside him. Outside, the city made its nighttime noise, traffic, and sirens, and the ambient hum of several million people living their lives simultaneously, the sound of a place that had no opinion about any individual within it and kept moving regardless. He sat with that for a little while. Then he picked up his phone and texted Dana. "Her name is Helena Whitmore," he wrote. "Look her up." He waited. 30 seconds. Then his phone started ringing. He let it ring twice before he answered. "Evan," Dana said, and her voice had the particular note of a person who had just run a search and was still processing the results. "Evan, what did you do?" "I went to the museum," he said, "and I think I'm going to call her tomorrow." A long pause. "The zeros," Dana said. "Did you see the zeros?" "Yeah." "And?" He thought about it. "They're not the most interesting thing about her," he said. Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Dana said finally, in the tone of someone who had decided to trust a process they didn't fully understand yet. "Okay, tell me everything." And he did. He called her Sunday afternoon. Not in the morning, because Sunday mornings belonged to Milo in a way that was non-negotiable, and also, genuinely, the part of the week Evan looked forward to most, the slow version of the morning, no school schedule pressing from behind. Waffles without urgency. Milo sprawled on the living room floor with whatever project he'd decided required his full attention before 10 o'clock. This particular Sunday, it was a Lego set that had been sitting in its box for 3 weeks, because Milo had decided the instructions were wrong and had been developing his own approach. Evan sat on the couch with his coffee and watched his son dismantle and rebuild the same section 4 systems with the focused persistence of someone who was going to solve this problem, regardless of how long it took. And he thought that Milo had gotten that from somewhere, and he wasn't entirely sure it was from him. He called Helena at 2:15 when Milo was napping, a thing that still happened on Sundays. Unpredictably, when a big week caught up with him, and he simply went horizontal on the couch with a book open on his chest and was asleep within 8 minutes without announcing that it was happening. She picked up on the second ring. "Evan," she said. No greeting before his name, no lead-in, just his name, as a statement of the fact that it was him, and she knew it, and this was adequate. "I was going to wait until tomorrow," he said. "I decided not to." "I know," a brief pause. "I could tell last night." From 3 words? From the speed of the 3 words. He sat in the kitchen, where he could see Milo through the doorway. "I want to figure out how this works," he said. "Not I don't mean the big version. I mean the practical version. How 2 people in completely different circumstances figure out the actual logistics of spending time together. That's a very architectural way to approach it. I'm an architect. Technically, you're a junior architect. You looked up my firm." "I looked up your firm," she confirmed, without any apology in it. "You looked me up too." "Fair." He wrapped one hand around his coffee mug. "I need it to be slow," he said. "Not because I'm not trying to manage expectations. I just have a child whose life has a specific rhythm, and I can't disrupt that rhythm, because I'm in a hurry about something for myself." "I'm not asking for hurry," she said. "I know. But I needed to say it. You say things directly when they matter. I've learned the cost of not saying them." Pause on her end, the kind she used when she was thinking rather than when she was composing. There was a difference, and he was starting to be able to tell them apart. "There's something I should tell you," she said. "Since we're being direct." "Okay, there will be scrutiny. At some point if this continues, I have a public profile I can't entirely manage. There are people who cover my professional life and sometimes my personal life, and they're not always careful about how they do it. If you're in my orbit for long enough, you'll be visible in ways you're not currently visible." Evan thought about that. Has that happened before? With someone you were seeing? Once. About 6 years ago, it was unpleasant for him. He wasn't prepared for it. What happened? He decided the unpleasantness wasn't worth it. She said it evenly, but there was something underneath the evenness, not self-pity, but something that had been processed into a fact a long time ago and still had weight. He wasn't wrong, necessarily. It was a reasonable calculation. But it would have been better if we'd discussed it earlier, rather than after. Evan looked at the ceiling. "So you're discussing it earlier?" "Yes. With me, with you." He was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that. I thought you would. Milo's not going to be in any of it," he said. Not a question. Just a statement with the same weight his voice carried on the sidewalk when he'd said he comes first. "No," she said immediately. "Absolutely not. If it ever got to a point where that was a risk, then we'd manage it before it became one." She said it without hesitation. "I have people whose job it is to manage exactly that kind of thing. And beyond that, a small pause, I wouldn't allow it. His life is not part of my public life." He believed her. Not blindly, he'd been paying attention for 2 weeks, and that was not enough to believe someone blindly, but with the particular calibration of trust that came from watching how a person behaved when they weren't performing. How she'd put the phone away on the museum steps. How she'd stayed in Milo's register during the entire dinosaur conversation. How she'd said absolutely not before he'd finished the sentence. Okay, he said. That's it, that's it. Another pause. I have a dinner Wednesday. A foundation event, one of those things where the food is genuinely excellent, and everyone is very serious about a cause, and also very interested in being seen being serious about a cause. She said it with the dry precision of someone who'd attended enough of them to have developed a taxonomy. I don't want to go alone, and I don't want to bring anyone from my professional life, because it will mean something I don't want it to mean. You want me to come? You'd hate it, she said. I want to be clear about that up front. Speeches are long, and the agenda is rigid, and everyone will want to know who you are and what your connection to me is. But you want me to come? Yes. He thought about his closet. He thought about the suit with the apple juice ghost, and whether there was time to do something about that before Wednesday, and what doing something about that would cost, and whether he could justify the cost against the grocery budget this week. I'll need to find someone for Milo Wednesday evening, he said. Of course, and I'll need to know what kind of event this is so I know what to wear. I'll send you the details. A brief pause. Evan.
Yeah.
The suit you wore to Ardennes is fine. He was quiet for a second. You could tell I noticed things. Neutral, not unkind. It's fine. I promise you nobody there is going to be looking at your suit. They might look at it and think I don't belong. You don't belong, she said. Neither do I at this point. I keep going anyway. Another pause, slightly different in quality. Wear whatever makes you comfortable. That's the whole instruction. He exhaled slowly. Okay, see you Wednesday, she said. He sat in his kitchen for a while after they hung up, listening to Milo breathe from the next room, the slow, audible breathing of deep afternoon sleep, and thinking about a foundation dinner and a suit, and the very specific way Helena Whitmore said his name when she picked up the phone. Not as a question, not as a performance, just as information stated plainly. As if his being there was something that didn't require adjustment. The foundation dinner was exactly as advertised. The food was excellent. The speeches were long. The room was full of people who wore their philanthropy the way they wore everything else, as a statement, as a position, as something that communicated their standing in a world where standing required constant maintenance. Evan sat beside Helena at a round table of 8 and drank water and listened to a 40-minute address about watershed conservation that was genuinely interesting for the first 20 minutes and became a different experience after that. Helena sat the way she always sat in professional contexts, with a stillness that was not rigidity but rather the stillness of someone who had decided, a long time ago, how much of themselves they were willing to give to any given room and stuck to it. She contributed to table conversation with the precision of someone expending exactly the right amount of social energy. She introduced Evan to the people around them as Evan Calloway, an architect, and then allowed him to handle his own conversation from there, which he did, because he was not incapable of talking to people, only sometimes out of practice. The woman to his left was on the foundation's board and was interested, genuinely interested, in urban development and affordable housing, and Evan found himself in a real conversation about the city's infrastructure priorities for the first time in months. He talked about the project he'd been pushing at the firm, the family housing design, the light wells, the communal space that made density feel less like compression and more like community. She listened in the same way Helena listened, which was to say with actual attention. Helena, talking to the man on her right about a different topic entirely, turned her head briefly during that conversation and caught Evan's eye. Just for a second. Nothing on her face that she hadn't authorized. But something. On the car ride back, the city sliding past the windows in its nighttime configuration, she said, "You were good in there. The woman from the board was interesting. She is." Helena looked out the window. She's also on the board of a development consortium that I've been in discussions with for 2 years. If she calls you, take the meeting. Evan looked at her. What? She took your card. You gave her your card. He had given her his card. He hadn't thought about it as anything other than normal professional exchange. Helena, I'm not engineering anything, she said, and there was a firmness to it that was also clarification. If she calls, it's because you gave her an interesting pitch, and she has use for an architect with your specific approach to family housing. That's entirely separate from me. He held that for a moment. You sure? The woman has been in real estate development for 30 years. She doesn't need me to point her toward interesting people. She finds them herself, a pause. You were interesting. You can accept that without it being complicated. He was finding, one of the things that required the most conscious effort around Helena separates the things that happened because of her proximity from the things that happened because of him. The instinct was to attribute everything to her orbit, because her orbit had the gravitational pull of someone who had been significant for decades. The discipline was to evaluate each thing on its own terms. She was right that the woman from the board had been genuinely interested. He'd felt it in the conversation. It had felt it in the conversation. It had felt like the kind of conversation where both people were getting something out of it, which was distinct from the performance of getting something out of it. He took the meeting 3 weeks later when the call came. That was later. What happened first was the night in December when the scrutiny she'd warned him about arrived. It was a photograph. He didn't see it himself. He didn't follow the kind of accounts that ran those photographs, and it would never have come across his feed on its own. Dana texted it to him on a Thursday morning with a message that was entirely punctuation. He looked at it on his phone while standing in the parking structure near his office. It was from a social account that aggregated celebrity and business figure sightings, not journalism, but not nothing either, the kind of low-grade surveillance that the publicly significant lived inside constantly without most people registering it as surveillance. The photograph was from the foundation dinner, a candid, taken from across the room. Helena at the table, mid-conversation with the man on her right, and Evan beside her, talking to the woman from the board, leaning forward slightly, the way he did when he was actually engaged. The caption identified Helena by name and described Evan as unknown companion and asked its followers if anyone knew who he was. There were, at the time Dana sent it, approximately 400 comments. He stared at this for a while in the parking structure, in the cold, with the ambient smell of concrete and exhaust that parking structures always had. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went to work. He told Helena that evening. He didn't text her from the parking structure. He waited until Milo was in bed, and he had the quiet of the apartment and could say it without his voice doing anything strange. "I saw it," she said, before he'd finished explaining. "I'm sorry, I should have anticipated that event would have photographers. You told me there would be scrutiny. Telling you and the first instance of it are different things."
Yeah.
He sat on the couch. "People in the comments are trying to figure out who I am. They'll figure it out. They're not particularly skilled investigators, but there's a lot of publicly available information about most people if you look for it." A pause. "When they publish it, and they will, it won't be accurate. It will be a version that fits the story they want to tell." "What story is that?" "Helena Whitmore and the Mystery Man," she said dryly. "Or Helena Whitmore and the Younger Man, depending on which angle they find more interesting." He absorbed this. "How younger am I going to sound?" 18 years. Another pause. "That will be a thing people say." "Does it bother you?" "The age difference." "No." She said it without hesitation. "Does it bother you?" He thought about it honestly. "I think it would bother me more if either of us was trying to ignore it." He looked at the ceiling. "It's there. It's a real thing. You've had 20 more years of everything than I have. That's not nothing." "No, it isn't. But it's not the most important thing either." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. So we don't ignore it and we don't let it run everything," he said. "That seems right," he exhaled. Okay, she said. "There's one more thing." He waited. "My board knows I'm seeing someone. I didn't tell them someone saw us at Franklin's, of all places. I got a call from my CFO who very carefully framed a personal inquiry as a professional concern. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who found the situation more tedious than threatening. There will be people in my professional life who have opinions about this. Some of those opinions will make their way to you." "What kind of opinions?" "That you're after my money. That you're after influence. That I'm not thinking clearly." A brief pause. The usual architecture of what people say when a powerful woman chooses someone they didn't pre-approve. Evan was quiet for a moment. "Are you thinking clearly?" "More clearly than I have in years," she said, "which some people will interpret as proof that I'm not." He considered that. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "CFO. The professional concern. Was any part of it legitimate? Is there an actual risk to the company from this being public?" She was quiet for a few seconds in a way that told him she was taking the question seriously rather than dismissing it. "Minimal. The company is structured such that my personal life and its public operations are separated. There are governance processes." She paused. "There is one board member who may use it as an opportunity to push for a review of executive decision-making authority, which he's been wanting to do for 2 years and hasn't had an angle on. Is he right to want that?" A longer pause. "Some version of it isn't entirely wrong," she said. And there was something in that admission, that he recognized as costing her something, the way true admissions sometimes did. I hold more unilateral authority than is probably good for the company at this stage. I built it when I was running it alone, and I haven't fully adjusted the structure as it's grown. Is that something you'd change? I've been thinking about changing it for 18 months, she said. I haven't, because every time I start the process, I find myself holding on to something I shouldn't need to hold on to anymore. What does holding on to it give you? The question landed in a particular way he could tell by the small silence that followed it. Not a thinking silence, more like a silence that recognized it, had been asked the right question, and needed a moment. The feeling that it can't fall apart without me, she said finally. Which is not the same as it actually being unable to fall apart without me. No, Evan said. It's not. You say that like a man who knows the difference. I spent the first year after Milo's mother left convinced that if I wasn't physically present every moment, something would go wrong. It took me another year to figure out that the vigilance was partly for him and partly for me. To prove something to myself, she was quiet for a while. He'd learned not to fill her silence as she used them. They were productive, and rushing them cut off whatever was developing inside them. What did you do, she said, when you figured that out? I started letting Priya put him to bed sometimes, he said. And I sat in the kitchen and felt terrible about it for 3 weeks, and nothing went wrong. She laughed quietly, and the laugh had the slightly rueful quality that real recognitions sometimes produce. That's a very small example. All the real examples are small, he said. That's the whole thing. The photograph situation resolved itself the way Helena had predicted his name appeared in the caption. 4 days later, Evan Calloway, architect, with a brief description that was factually correct in outline and wrong in almost every implication, presenting him as someone who had strategically positioned himself into Helena's sphere, which was so backward from what had actually happened that it was almost funny. Almost. He called his sister before she could call him, because he needed to deliver the information himself before it arrived through other channels. Dana was quiet for much longer than she usually was, which for Dana was uncharacteristic. Evan, she said finally, I know, people are going to say things. At work. To Milo's teachers. Just people in general. A pause. Are you ready for that? He thought about the parking structure that morning. Phone in his pocket, the concrete smell, the cold. He thought about putting it away and going to work. Not entirely, he said, but I think that's probably right. What do you mean? I mean, if I was completely ready, it might mean I'd stop thinking about it clearly. He sat at the kitchen table. Parts that are uncomfortable for real reasons. Milo being photographed, I'd burn the whole thing down over that. My private life becoming a caption that's unpleasant but manageable. People at work having opinions, he shrugged, which Dana couldn't see but could probably infer. I've had people at work have opinions about me being a single father for 6 years. It's not new. Dana was quiet for another moment. Do you actually like her? She asked. Not the situation. Her, the person. He thought about Helena at the museum, crouched to Milo's level. He thought about the diner and the stolen fry and the bad coffee she'd drunk without complaint. He thought about absolutely, not before he'd finished the sentence. Yeah, he said, I do. Okay. Dana said it the way she'd said it after the first phone call, with the tones of someone who had decided to trust a process they didn't fully understand, but thought was probably going somewhere real. Then the rest is just noise. Most of it. What's not noise? He considered. The actual shape of it, he said. Making sure Milo is okay. Making sure she and I are honest with each other when things are hard. Making sure I don't lose track of what's my work, my sense of myself, just because being around her makes that easier to lose. Is it making it easier to lose? No, he said, and was slightly surprised by how certain he was. Pushes back. When I said something at dinner 2 weeks ago about maybe not pursuing the housing project because the economics weren't there, she asked me 3 questions, and by the third one I'd talked myself back into it. He paused. She didn't tell me what to think. She just asked the right questions. She sounds like a good editor, Dana said. He thought about it. Yeah, he said. That's right. The board member made his move in January, as Helena had predicted. A formally worded motion requesting an external review of executive decision-making protocols, submitted with the kind of careful procedural language that was designed to look institutional rather than personal. Helena told Evan about it on a Tuesday night at his kitchen table, which was where they'd been having the conversations that required a table, the ones that needed a surface to put things on, metaphorically. She told him because she didn't not tell him things anymore, which was itself something that had happened gradually, the way the important things tended to happen, without a specific moment that was the before and the after, just the steady accumulation of evenings and phone calls, and Franklin's diner, and one spectacularly failed attempt at cooking dinner at his apartment that had resulted in the smoke alarm going off twice and Milo appearing in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas to assess the situation with an expression of someone who was not surprised but was gathering data. "What are you going to do?" Evan asked. "I'm going to approve it," she said. He looked at her. "The review," she clarified. "I'm going to approve the review. Let them look at the structure. Let them make recommendations." She had her coffee mug, the Franklin's mug, which had migrated to his apartment gradually, and was now simply there, in the cabinet, and she was turning it in her hands the way Evan had turned his water glass at Ardennes the night they'd met. Because they're not entirely wrong that the structure needs updating. And because approving it removes the only leverage he has. "Is that the main reason?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "The main reason is that I've been holding on to something I should have let go of 2 years ago, and I've been looking for the moment that felt right to let it go. And I think the moment is probably just a decision rather than a feeling." He recognized that. "Yeah," he said. "It usually is," says the man who called me on a Sunday afternoon. Says the man who called you on a Sunday afternoon. She looked at him steadily across the kitchen table, his kitchen table in his apartment, with Milo asleep in the next room and the particular quiet of a winter night outside. She looked at him with the same directness she'd brought to every room he'd ever seen her in, and also saw some things underneath it that had come open gradually over the past months. Some layer of herself that she didn't deploy in board meetings or foundation dinners or professional photographs. "I told you I didn't know how to take a vacation," she said. "That first night at Franklin's. You said you couldn't find the version of yourself that would enjoy it."
"Yes."
A pause. "I think I've been finding her." He held her gaze. "Where is she?" The corner of her mouth moved. Drinking terrible coffee at a kitchen table in a not very large apartment on the 4th floor of a building that needs its lobby painted. She looked around the kitchen, briefly the grocery list on the refrigerator, the Lego piece on the counter that had been migrating from surface to surface for a week, the Milo drawings held up with masking tape because they didn't have a bulletin board. "Here," she said. "She's here." He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Some things required the space of silence to stay what they were. After a while, she looked at her watch. "I should go." Early meeting, 7 o'clock call with the Tokyo office. She stood, picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "Milo has the field trip tomorrow. Natural History Museum, ironically. Tell him to check whether they've updated the sauropod section. Last time I was there, the Brachiosaurus label was using outdated mass estimates. I will tell him exactly that, and he will spend the entire field trip focused on nothing else." "Good." She put on her coat. "That's good." He walked her to the door, which he always did, not because she needed walking to the door, but because the apartment was small, and the door was close, and it was just where things ended up. She had her coat buttoned, and her bag over her shoulder, and the particular composed self-possession of a woman who was 50 years old, and knew exactly who she was, including the parts she was still figuring out. She looked at him. "Wednesday," she said. "Franklin's?" he asked. "Franklin's," she confirmed. She went out the door and he heard her heels on the hallway floor, the elevator, and then the building door below, faint through the window. He stood in his kitchen for a moment. He picked up the Lego piece from the counter and put it in the bin on the shelf where the other displaced pieces went. He washed the 2 coffee mugs, dried them, put hers in the cabinet. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the street below, the city in its winter nighttime mode, the streetlights, a cab, 2 people walking fast against the cold. He thought about where things had been 4 months ago. The restaurant, the empty chair, the suit with the apple juice ghost, which he'd had cleaned in November and which was now clean, though he still knew where the stain had been. He thought about the ways things changed without announcing themselves, about how the shape of his days had stayed fundamentally the same: Milo, work, the subway, the grocery budgets, the school pickups, and how something had also shifted inside that shape. Some quality of the light, some sense that the rotation of deadlines and bedtime stories was not all there was. He wasn't naive about what lay ahead. The board review, persistent noise of public life, the conversations that would still need to be had, the places where their worlds would continue to press against each other in ways that required navigation rather than feeling. The work of it. He'd always been good at work. turned off the kitchen light, and went to check on Milo, who was asleep, arm over the edge of the bed, the new ankylosaurus on the nightstand, in the specific position that indicated it had been placed there deliberately. He stood in the doorway. He thought about a woman who had sat down across from him in a restaurant when he was reaching for his coat. He thought about how the smallest pivots changed everything. He went to bed. For the first time in a while, he slept without the low-grade vigilance that had been the background frequency of his nights for 4 years, the half-alertness that was always listening for Milo, always doing the quiet arithmetic of the week ahead, always braced for the particular weight of being the only one in the room who was responsible for all of it. He slept the way people slept when they'd stopped carrying something alone. Not because someone had taken it from him, because someone had sat down beside him and made it, simply, less. The external review took 11 weeks. Helena had approved it in January with the kind of deliberate calm that Evan had come to recognize as distinct from actual calm, the surface composure of someone who had made a decision they believed in and was now waiting for the decision to prove itself, which was a different thing from certainty. She'd sat across from him at Franklin's the Wednesday, after submitting the approval, eaten her fries with the same focus she brought to everything, and described the process in the specific, measured language of someone reporting facts rather than feelings. They'll look at governance structure, decision-making authority, board oversight protocols. She'd said, "It'll take about 3 months. Are you nervous?" She'd looked at him. "I don't get nervous about things I've decided are right." That's not an answer to the question. A pause. "I'm uncomfortable," she'd said finally. "Nervous implies uncertainty about the outcome. I know the outcome is probably going to be fine. The discomfort is about the process, about other people looking at something I built and telling me where it's structurally unsound, like a building inspection. Exactly like a building inspection. Those are useful," he'd said. "I know they are." She'd looked at the table. "I still don't like them." He'd understood. There was a particular kind of person, and both of them were, in different ways, this kind of person for whom the building had to be sound, not because someone told them it needed to be, but because they needed to know it themselves. The inspection wasn't the problem. The problem was that an inspection implied you might have missed something, and missing something meant that the structure you'd built from your own effort and intelligence and 20 years of relentless attention had gaps you hadn't seen. It was hard for people like that to let other eyes in. He knew this because he was still, occasionally, doing it himself. The woman from the foundation board, Margaret Osai, her name turned out to be, which he'd learned when she'd called in late November, exactly as Helena had predicted. She had offered him a consulting engagement on a residential development project in March. A real one, not junior-level drafting, not interior specifications for corporate lobbies, but actual design work on a family housing complex with the specific parameters he'd been pushing for at the firm light, communal space, density that didn't feel like compression. He'd almost said no, not because he didn't want it, because he did want it, and wanting it made him careful in the particular way that wanting things you might lose made you careful. He'd sat with the offer for 3 days, turning it over the way Milo turned the Lego pieces over before committing to where they went, looking at it from every angle. He'd told Helena about it on the 3rd day. She'd listened without interrupting, which she was always good at. And then she'd asked, "What's the actual risk? That it doesn't come through me. That it only came to me because Margaret met me at your event. I told you I know what you told me." I know she found the conversation interesting on its own terms. He'd been sitting at his kitchen table, phone to his ear, Milo doing homework in the next room. But I can't fully rule it out. And if I build something real on a foundation that had an asterisk, Evan. Her voice had been direct without being hard. Margaret Osei has been in real estate development for 30 years. She did not survive 30 years in that industry by outsourcing her judgment to other people's relationships. If she's offering you a project, it's because she thinks you can do the project. A pause. You're allowed to accept things you've earned, even if the introduction came from somewhere lucky. That's easy to say. It is. It's also true. He'd taken the meeting. He'd taken the engagement. He'd started on the preliminary designs in February, working evenings at the kitchen table after Milo was in bed, with the particular absorbed focus that real work produced, the kind where an hour passed without him registering it. The work was good. He knew it was good not because someone told him, but because he could feel the difference between work he was executing and work he was actually doing, and this was the second kind. His firm had complicated feelings about it. His supervisor, a man named Gerald, who was professionally meticulous and personally inscrutable, had called him into a meeting to discuss what Gerald called conflicts of professional interest, and what Evan recognized as Gerald trying to figure out whether Evan's outside engagement was going to make him harder to manage. Evan had been respectful and clear, and had left the meeting with Gerald no more resolved than when it started, which was fine. He was 32 years old, and had been junior for long enough. Talked to Helena about that too. At some point, she'd said, "The question is whether you're staying somewhere out of loyalty or out of habit. Those feel similar from the inside. Is there a third option?" "Fear," she'd said. "That one also feels similar." He'd thought about that for 2 weeks. In April, he gave notice. Not impulsively, he was not an impulsive person. Had not been an impulsive person since approximately the week after Milo's mother had left, when necessity had burned impulsiveness out of him and replaced it with something steadier, if less exciting. He'd spent 2 weeks building a realistic picture of what independent consulting could look like in practice, what the actual numbers needed to be, what the cushion required so that one bad month didn't cascade into a crisis. He'd made a spreadsheet. He'd looked at the spreadsheet for 3 evenings. He'd shown it to Helena, who had looked at it without offering to fix anything in it, which he appreciated. "It's conservative," she'd said. "On purpose. I know. That's not a criticism." She'd handed it back. "You've accounted for everything. Almost everything. I haven't accounted for the things I can't predict. Nobody can." "Right. Are you okay with that?" He'd looked at the spreadsheet. He'd thought about 6 years of being the only variable in Milo's life that he could control, the vigilance of it, the exhaustion of carrying a structure that couldn't have gaps. He'd thought about building inspection and what it required to say, "Look at this. Tell me what I missed." "I'm getting there," he'd said. He gave notice in April. His last day was the first week of May, and Gerald shook his hand with the slight stiffness of someone who hadn't predicted this particular outcome and was pretending he had, and 2 junior colleagues took him out for drinks that Thursday evening, and told him things about his work that he hadn't known they'd noticed, and he walked home afterward in the mild spring air of the city, thinking that it was strange how you could spend years somewhere without fully knowing what impression you'd made. The board review concluded in mid-April. The recommendations were, as Helena had predicted, largely structural. Clearer separation between executive authority and board oversight on decisions above a certain threshold. A formal succession protocol, which the company had lacked entirely, which the review report noted with the diplomatic understatement of consultants paid to be diplomatic. A semi-annual governance review built into the board calendar. None of it was designed to diminish Helena's authority. It was designed to make the company less dependent on any single person's presence to function. The board member who had initiated the motion, a man named Torrance, whom Helena described with characteristic neutrality as someone who is not entirely wrong about things, but has a limited range of acceptable methods for being right, accepted the outcome, without the vindication he'd clearly anticipated, because the outcome wasn't vindication. It was documentation of things Helena had already decided to change, which was a different thing. She told Evan about it on a Saturday morning at his kitchen table, which had become, over the months, a location with its own meaning, the place where real conversations happened, as distinct from the Franklin's conversations, which were the easy ones, the ones that didn't require a surface to put things on. Milo was at Dana's for the weekend. The apartment had that particular quality it had without Milo in it, slightly larger and much quieter. "How do you feel?" Evan asked. "Relieved," she said, and she paused, looking at her coffee, like someone who spent a long time holding their breath and has finally breathed out. "That's a good thing it is." She looked up at him. "I'm delegating the infrastructure division to my managing director. Fully. I'll have oversight, but not operational control." She said it the way she'd said absolutely not about Milo being photographed before she'd finished the sentence, like it was already decided, and the saying of it was just catching up. "He's been ready for 2 years. I've been holding him back. Does he know he's been ready?" "He knows now. I told him Wednesday." He looked like a man who'd been waiting for a door to open for so long that when it finally did, he wasn't sure it was real. A pause. I recognized the expression. Evan looked at her. She looked back, steadily, with the specific directness that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her at Ardennes, and that had not diminished once in the 8 months since. "You're reorganizing it," he said. "I am. Into what?" She was quiet for a moment. "Something that doesn't need me to be every room, simultaneously," she said. Something that I built and can trust to keep standing when I'm not watching it every minute. He understood the weight of that. That's hard to do. The hardest thing I've done professionally, she said. Harder than starting it. Starting it was just fear and momentum. This requires something different. She paused. It requires knowing that my worth isn't only in the doing. That the building matters more than whether I'm the one holding it up. He let that sit. Outside, the city was doing its Saturday morning version of itself, less frantic than the weekday version, the particular frequency of a day that wasn't in a hurry. He thought about what she'd just said. He thought about 6 years of being the only person holding things up, and how it had taken him a long time to learn that Milo didn't need him to be everything. Milo needed him to be present, which was related to but not identical to being everything. He thought about the specific moment when he'd let Priya put Milo to bed the first time and sat in the kitchen feeling terrible about it, and how nothing had gone wrong, and how he'd had to feel terrible about it 3 more times before the terrible feeling had started to subside. You already started, he said, last year. She looked at him. About the time someone sat in my car instead of arguing with me about it. He remembered. The night outside Ardennes, the car she'd sent home, the sidewalk, the freezing air. I wasn't trying to make a point, he'd said that night. I know, she'd said. That was the point. The spring moved into summer the way seasons did in the city, which was to say imperfectly and with several weeks of weather that couldn't decide what it was. Milo finished kindergarten in June with a ceremony that ran 40 minutes over schedule and that Evan attended with Helena for the first time at any school event, which produced a range of reactions from other parents that ran from genuine warmth to the kind of polite, slightly over-careful friendliness that meant people had looked Helena up. Milo accepted her presence at the ceremony with the equanimity of a child who had decided, in the particular way of children, that the situation was what it was, and what mattered was that both of his important people were in the room. He performed the dinosaur portion of his class's end-of-year project. Each child had chosen an animal and presented 3 facts with the composure of someone who had been preparing for this specific moment for most of the year. His 3 facts about the Carnotaurus were correct, sourced, and slightly beyond what the assignment required. His teacher gave him full marks and a slightly exhausted look. Dana attended also, sitting next to Evan, and spent approximately 4 minutes watching Helena watch Milo's presentation before leaning over and saying in a very quiet voice, "She's actually rooting for him." "Yeah," Evan said. "Not performing rooting for him. Actually doing it." "I know." Dana looked at him sideways. "I was worried you were going to make this complicated," she said. "I make everything complicated." "Less than usual," she said. "With this." He thought about that. He thought it was probably true. He thought the reason it was probably true was that he'd been too tired, by the time Helena had sat down across from him, to be complicated in the ways he usually was. Sometimes exhaustion did that, burned off the protective layers and left you with the simpler version of yourself. The version that looked at a woman who had sent her car away to stand on a cold sidewalk and thought, this is a real thing, and real things deserve to be met, honestly. Milo's first grade started in September. His teacher was a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, who took Milo's paleontological expertise in stride and who, by October, had incorporated a rotating student expert format into her science lessons that resulted in Milo delivering a 15-minute presentation on Cretaceous megafauna to his classmates, which Evan heard about in full detail over dinner. "Mrs. Alvarez says I can do the next one on marine reptiles," Milo said. "Mosasaurs. Are they dinosaurs?" Evan asked. Milo put his fork down and looked at Evan with an expression that had been perfected through many iterations of this exact exchange. "They're not dinosaurs, Dad." "Right. They're mosasaurs. The classification is completely different." "Right. You know this. I'm testing you." Milo picked his fork back up. "You're not testing me. You always forget." He looked across the table at Helena. "He always forgets." "He does," Helena agreed. "You remembered," Milo said. "For the first time I told you, you always remembered." "I wrote it down," she said the first time, "so I wouldn't forget." Milo looked at her. This was apparently significant, the writing down. Something in his expression shifted in the way it had shifted in front of the Carnotaurus display. That particular recalibration of an estimate. "Why?" Helena looked at him steadily. "Because it mattered to you. Things that matter to people I care about, I try to remember them." Milo was quiet for a moment. He looked at his plate. Then he said, with the directness of a 7-year-old, who did not have the machinery for indirection, "Do you care about me?" The table went very still. Evan held himself exactly where he was. Helena looked at Milo with an expression that Evan had not seen on her face before, not the boardroom composure, not the diner ease, not even the unguarded quality of the Blue Whale Room. Something older than all of those. Something that had been waiting for this specific question and had known, without knowing when it would arrive, that it would. Yes, she said simply. No architecture around it. I do. Milo looked at her for another moment with the assessment eyes. Then he nodded once. The way he nodded when he'd received information that fit with what he'd already suspected and had now confirmed. Okay, he said, and picked up his fork. Evan exhaled so quietly that only he knew he'd done it. After Milo was in bed that evening, Helena sat on the couch, with her legs curled up in a way she rarely sat anywhere outside of this apartment, holding her coffee the Franklin's mug, still resident in the cabinet, and Evan sat beside her in the specific configuration that had developed over months, close but not pressed. The natural geometry of two people who had found a comfortable proximity. He asked me directly, she said. He does that, I know. She paused. I wasn't expecting it that way. At dinner. Did you mean it? She looked at him. Of course I meant it. I know. I just wanted to hear you say it again. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said quietly, he's a remarkable person. He's 7, and he's already more himself than most adults I know. He's been himself since day 1, Evan said. It's kind of alarming. It's not alarming. It's what happens when someone lets a child be who they are instead of who's convenient. She held his gaze. You did that. He looked at the coffee mug. I've made every mistake there is. Yes. And you kept showing up anyway. She said it without sentiment, just as an accounting of facts. That's the whole job. He thought about what it had cost. Years of it. The vigilance. The low-grade exhaustion that had lived in his bones. For so long he'd stopped registering it as exhaustion and started registering it as just the texture of being alive. He thought about the night at Ardennes, reaching for his coat, believing without having examined the belief that being stood up was a verdict rather than an event. He thought about how wrong he'd been, not in the dramatic sense, not in the way of revelations, just wrong, in the quiet, accumulative way that people were wrong about themselves when they'd been too tired for too long to look clearly. He had not been too little. He had been, by any reasonable measure, exactly enough. It had taken someone sitting down across from him and paying attention for him to see that. He was going to spend a long time being grateful for the specific woman who had done that, and the specific restaurant, and the specific date, who had never shown up. He said something he'd been circling for weeks. I want to ask you something. Helena looked at him. And I need you to know that I'm not asking because things are good right now, and it seems like the right time, he said. I'm asking because I've known for a while, and I kept waiting for the moment to feel obvious. And I think I've figured out that it's not going to feel obvious. It's going to be a decision. She was very still. I know how your life works, he said. I know it's complicated, and I know it has parts that are never going to be simple, and I know that some of those parts are going to press on my life in ways that require real navigation. I know you hold things tightly, and sometimes that's going to be a thing we have to work on. He looked at her. I also know that you wrote down Milo's dinosaur classifications, so you wouldn't forget them. I know you sent your car home on a cold sidewalk because you wanted me to know you were making a choice. I know that when Milo asked you a question you could have deflected, you didn't. He reached across and took her hand. She let him. I want to marry you, he said. Not because it fixes anything or because it makes the complicated parts simple, but because the person I want to be standing next to when things are hard is you. And the table I want to come home to is the one where you're drinking that terrible coffee and arguing with me about the city's infrastructure budget. Her hand was very still in his. I have a ring, he said. It's not this kind of ring that comes from someone who can match your world financially. And I need you to know that I thought about that for a long time. And then I decided that it's the ring I chose for you, and that's what makes it right. Helena looked at him. And Helena Whitmore, who had negotiated billion-dollar agreements across conference tables in 7 countries, who had built a company from savings and a partially delusional level of confidence, and 20 years of relentless effort, who had sat in board meetings with people who had underestimated her and had outlasted every single one of them. Helena Whitmore could not for a moment speak, not because she was uncertain, because she was so certain, so completely and immediately certain, that the certainty had produced something she didn't have immediate access to words for. She had spent 50 years in a life that rewarded the precise deployment of language, the right word in the right register at the right moment, and she was sitting on a couch in a not very large apartment on the fourth floor of a building that needed its lobby painted, holding the hand of a man who had looked her up not to find out what she was worth, but because he'd been curious about who she was, and she had nothing, just the certainty. She found her voice. "The ring doesn't matter," she said. Her voice was slightly different than usual. Not broken, just less managed. "I know, but I needed to say it." "I know you did." She looked at him. "Yes." "Yeah?" "Yes, Evan." And now something moved across her face, the full version of the expression she'd been allowing out in increments over the past year, something unguarded and warm and real, the Helena that the magazine profile had never seen and the boardroom had never seen and the foundation dinners had never seen, the one who'd stood under the blue whale and remembered why she used to come there. "It's yes." It was yes before you finished the sentence. He reached into the drawer of the side table. She watched him do it with an expression of someone who had not known the ring was there and was now recalibrating, and brought out a small box, dark blue, kind of box that announced itself by being exactly what it was. He opened it. The ring was simple. A single stone set low, the kind of thing designed to be worn rather than displayed. He'd spent an afternoon choosing it with the same careful attention he brought to design problems, looking for the thing that was right for the person, rather than right for the occasion. She looked at it for a moment. "It's right," she said. "Yeah, it's exactly right." He put it on her finger. It fit. He'd gotten her size from a ring she'd left on the bathroom counter 2 months ago, which he'd measured with a piece of string and a ruler, which was either very romantic or very architectural, depending on how you looked at it. She looked at her hand. He looked at her. They sat like that for a while, in the quiet apartment with Milo asleep in the next room and the city doing its nighttime thing outside, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, which was one of the things Evan had understood gradually, was a measure of how right something was not whether it was loud and obvious, but whether the silences inside it were comfortable. These were. They told Milo in the morning, was at the kitchen table with the waffle, and Evan sat across from him and said that he had something to tell him, and Milo looked up with the alert assessment of a child who understood that something to tell you was a registers that preceded significant information. Evan told him. Milo looked at Helena, then at Evan, then at Helena's hand, which she'd rested on the table. He looked at the ring for a moment with the focused attention he applied to things that required examination. "So she's going to live here?" he asked. "We'll figure out the details," Evan said. "But yes, eventually." Milo thought about this. "She'll need more closet space," he said. "You have a lot of stuff in the closet." "I'll make room," Evan said. "The bathroom is small. We'll manage." Milo looked at Helena again. Something moved through his expression, not the assessment eyes this time. Something softer and slightly less composed. The expression of a 7-year-old who was feeling something he didn't yet have language for and was trying to locate the edges of it. "Are you happy?" he asked Helena. She looked at him steadily. "Very," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then I'm going to need you to learn the difference between a Brachiosaurus and a Brontosaurus." Brontosaurus was reclassified as a valid genus in 2015 after 100 years of being considered a duplicate of Apatosaurus, Helena said. "Key skeletal distinctions are." Milo stared at her. "I read more last night," she said. Milo turned to Evan. "She read more last night, I heard." Milo looked back at his waffle. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of someone who had completed a lengthy and complex assessment and arrived at a conclusion, "Okay," he said. "Good." He ate his waffle. Evan looked at Helena across the kitchen table. She looked back at him. The wedding was in March, 14 months after a restaurant table for one had become a table for two, without either of them planning it. They'd debated the scale of it for weeks, and the debate itself had been instructive. Helena's default was toward the kind of event her professional life required her to produce, large and documented and visible, and Evan's default was toward something small enough that he'd actually be present in it, rather than performing being present in it. They'd compromised on small and done it properly, which turned out to mean 40 people in a rented space above a restaurant that did not serve rubber chicken, with flowers that were genuinely nice, and a dinner that was genuinely good, and speeches that were short, because Evan had asked everyone to keep them short, and Helena had issued what she called a strong recommendation to the same effect, which everyone understood was a direction. Dana cried at the ceremony. She would later deny this with moderate conviction. Margaret Osei came with her husband and told Evan. At the reception, that the family housing project had cleared its second funding review and was moving into full design phase, and that she was pleased with the preliminary work, which from Margaret was roughly equivalent to effusive praise from anyone else. Milo was the ring bearer. He had requested this role himself. In November, after it had become clear what was happening, and had taken it with the seriousness of someone who understood that the role carried weight. He walked down the short aisle between the rows of chairs with the focused precision of a child who had been told once, clearly, what was required and was executing it exactly. He handed the rings to Evan without dropping them, which he'd been slightly worried about and had practiced 3 times. The reception, Milo danced with Helena. He was not a good dancer. Neither was she, particularly. She moved with the slightly stiff grace of someone who had learned to dance from obligation rather than inclination, and was working from technique rather than instinct. Milo moved with the complete abandon of a 7-year-old who had not yet been told that dancing required self-consciousness, which meant he was, by any reasonable measure, the better dancer. Taught her a move that he had invented himself and that had no name. She did it badly. He laughed. She laughed too, and it was the same laugh as the diner's short reel, slightly surprised by itself. Evan stood at the edge of the dance floor and watched. He thought about what it cost to stay open to things. Not naive, he'd never been naive, not even before Milo, and certainly not after, but open. Willing to let a strange evening be a strange evening instead of forcing it immediately into a shape you already understood. He thought about all the ways he could have closed off instead. Coat already in his hand. The reasonable decision to go home, pay the babysitter, absorb the small embarrassment of being stood up and file it as evidence that dating was more trouble than it was worth. He thought about how close he'd come to exactly that. And he thought about what he'd nearly missed. This was the thing nobody told you about the life you almost didn't let happen. It didn't announce itself as significant when it was arriving. It looked like a woman sitting down in an empty chair. It looked like a conversation about bad coffee and apple juice stains and dinosaur taxonomy. It looked like 2 people being honest with each other because they were both too tired to be anything else, and finding, inside that honesty, something they hadn't been looking for. You didn't find the big things by looking for the big things. You found them by being present for the small ones and having the sense not to leave before they became something. Stayed. She'd stayed. Milo was currently demonstrating the unnamed dance move to Helena for the 3rd time, with increasing theatrical commitment, and Helena was attempting it with the same focused effort she brought to everything, and failing, and not minding the failure, which was its own kind of evidence. Evan thought about what 50 looked like from where Helena stood, and what 32 looked like from where he stood, and whether those numbers added up to anything that mattered. He'd spent a long time thinking that the distance between their lives was the most important variable, the money, the age, the worlds that pressed against each other in ways that required navigation. He'd spent a long time treating the distance as the story. It wasn't the story. The distance was just the weather. It was the thing you moved through to get somewhere, the conditions you navigated, the friction that told you whether what you were building was real or just easy. Easy things didn't require that you know yourself. Real things did. Real things asked you to be honest about what you were afraid of and what you wanted, and whether you could hold both at once without the fear winning. Real things asked you to stay in the room when staying was harder than leaving. He'd had practice at that. 6 years of practice in an apartment with cracked bathroom tiles and Lego pieces on every surface, and a specific small person who had needed him to show up every day regardless of how the day before had gone. 6 years of staying in the room. It turned out that was the training. Not for anything grand. Just for the ordinary work of building a life with another person, the disagreements and the navigation and the moments that required you to say the hard thing instead of the comfortable thing. The willingness to let someone see you without the parts you managed, and to keep looking at them when they did the same. Helena had let him see her. He had let her see him. They were still, both of them, figuring out the parts they hadn't shown each other yet. He knew that. There was a version of the next year that would include moments of real difficulty, the friction of 2 lives combining. The things they'd assumed would be easy that turned out not to be. The things they'd agreed on in principle that turned out harder in practice. He didn't have any illusions about that. He also didn't have any illusions about what was on the other side of those difficulties. More evenings at the kitchen table. More Franklin's Diner on Wednesdays. More Milo at the Natural History Museum correcting exhibit labels with Helena crouched beside him, asking real questions. More of the particular quality of a morning in that apartment, waffle-scented and loud and imperfect and entirely, completely full. Full in the way that mattered. Not full of events or achievements or the visible markers of a life well documented. Full in the way of a room where the people in it were actually present, actually themselves, actually paying attention to each other. Helena had said it months ago, in the kitchen, trying to locate the version of herself that had gotten lost somewhere inside 50 years of ambition. Here, she'd said, she's here. He understood now that she'd been talking about something bigger than an apartment. She'd been talking about what happened when you stopped running your life as an argument you needed to win and started running it as a place you actually wanted to be. He'd learned that lesson a different way, earlier, under different circumstances. But he'd learned it. You could have a full bank account and an empty life. You could have an empty bank account and a life so full it made noise. The secret, if it was a secret, which he didn't think it was, he thought it was just a truth that got buried under the speed of things. The secret was that fullness didn't come from what you accumulated. It came from what you chose to let matter. And then it came from being willing to sit with those things long enough for them to become real. An empty chair had become a table for two. A table for two had become a kitchen for three. And Evan Calloway, who had entered that restaurant at 7:30 on a Thursday evening believing, without quite realizing he believed it, that being stood up was a kind of verdict on who he was. Evan Calloway stood at the edge of a dance floor watching his wife teach his son to do a dance move that didn't exist yet, and knew, without any doubt and without any performance of knowing, that he had been wrong. He had always been enough. It had just taken the right empty chair to show him where to sit.